My name is Rod Ewing, and welcome to the third of a series of four presentations from this year's honors cohort. Today, we'll be hearing from Carter Clelland and Kate Yeager. And I want to really say how pleased we are with the participation of the outside world in this honors seminar. And I should say, when I say we, I mean the teaching team as well as the students. And the teaching team is composed of Professor Amy Ziegart and Dr. Asfandiar Mir. Just a few words on the procedures. The presentations will be about 20 minutes long. We'll have 10 minutes for questions. Between the two presentations, we'll take a 5-minute break. When we turn to the questions, the tradition is that we offer the advisors the first opportunity to ask the questions. Others, particularly in the outer room, let's say, if you have questions, please use your Q&A function. And if we have time, we'll certainly raise those questions. I'll pose those questions to the students. All right, the first speaker this afternoon will be Carter Clelland. Carter is a senior majoring in international relations with specializations in international security, East and South Asia, as well as German studies. Growing up in Phoenix, he has extended his affinity to Latin America into his thesis by writing about Chinese investments across various Latin American states. After graduation, he will be moving to Bologna, Italy, and Washington, D.C. For a master's in international relations at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies. So, Carter, it's all yours.
Thank you for the introduction, Dr. Ewing. I'm going to first share my slides. Can I just get a confirmation that slides can be seen?
Yeah.
Perfect. In that case, let's begin. Thank you all for coming to my presentation today on Chinese investment strategy in Latin America. You've all probably seen some form of this map, heard some sort of this idea about the Belt and Road Initiative, also known as the One Belt, One Road Initiative. It's a massive infrastructural vision put out by China's President Xi. It was announced in 2013 and seeks to connect the world to China by promoting global development. One important note is that not all Chinese projects in the world are part of BRI. In fact, a lot of the projects within Latin America are not part of BRI, but are still Chinese funded. Such a grand economic vision only became realistic or a possibility after China experienced decades worth of high annual growth. I mean, you had in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s under Chairman Mao, very closed off China. The following leader, Deng Xiaoping, opened up China with some economic reforms. China began seeing increased growth, and then in 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization, and that really allowed its exports and economy to grow. Once its economy was growing, it began to look more outward at investments, and a lot of those investments found themselves in Latin America. Before 2005, there were no Chinese investments in Latin America. From 2005 to 2009, as you can see in both of these graphs, there was very minimal investment. And just for context, the one on the left is the cumulative amount of money spent by China or Chinese companies invested in Latin America per year. And on the right is the number of projects. Throughout my thesis, I actually use both the number of projects and net investments or cumulative investment as measures to test my hypotheses, because you might have one project that just costs a lot, and I don't want that to give a false illusion that China's really invested in that one country when there's only one project. Alternatively, if there's like 20 really small projects, I don't want that to give the impression that China doesn't care about this country. In fact, it has 20 projects. So we'll look at both. And after 2010 till now, you see an average of around $18 billion every year of Chinese investment in Latin America. I always like looking at the slide because it gives an idea of how much China is investing in each region of the world. And Latin America has a sizable amount, especially beginning in 2010. In fact, an amount that is quite similar to that in Africa. And Africa gets a lot of attention. Latin America has not gotten so much attention, which led me to want to speak about Latin America today. Another reason that led to my thesis question, which I'll uncover in a bit, is after I saw a bunch of these headlines, whether they're think tanks or news articles, you see China, at least these titles saying China debt diplomacy, or using investments to get strategic assets around the world, or instituting corruption in foreign countries. I wanted to see, do any of these claims play out in Latin America? Leading me to the broader question of why do certain Latin American countries receive substantially more Chinese investment than others? Today's plan is we're first going to go over the hypotheses and literature, followed by methods, the results, my favorite part, and what does that mean for policy. The data I used to analyze Chinese investment comes from the American Enterprise Institute's China Global Investment Tracker. This is a database of as many Chinese investments found by these two think tanks, and they put them all into a database looking at investments from 2005 till 2020. In fact, they're still updating every year, but mine goes up through 2020. All the investments are at least $100 million. And I find this to be the most comprehensive data set of Chinese investments that I could find. So in fact, I'm using it. I was wanting to use official Chinese data, but that is not published annually, and it is not quite transparent, making it hard to do a social science study. So I end up with this. And this data set includes 21 Latin American countries. So we'll be looking at all 21 in my thesis today. When I examined and analyzed the data, I find that regardless of whether you look at Chinese investment by number of projects or by cumulative investment amount, you find the same 5 countries appear in the top 5 recipients of Chinese investment money, those being Brazil, Peru, Argentina, Venezuela, and Ecuador. So this goes back to my question, why these 5? Why not Mexico? Why not Colombia? Why not Chile? And that's what I'm seeking to explain. Before we go into the hypotheses, I just want to talk about how investment decisions are made, how are they agreed upon? And so I came up with a list on each side of potential decision-making factors. On the Chinese side, they might be considering, okay, what about corruption levels in the Latin American country? How about the commodities offered from that Latin American country? Are any of interest? How's the economic health? Are they high in debt? Do they repay their debt? Will I get money back? Or am I just going to put money in and lose it? US security partnerships being, if this Latin American country is in a close security partnership with the United States, it might not bode well if Chinese-US relations sour. Also, UN voting behavior. The Latin American country, do they vote in a way that might be favorable or unfavorable to China that economic influence may or may not be able to influence? Finally, access to US markets. Could investing in a Latin American country help with access to the US and its markets? On the Latin American side, some considerations are domestic politics, public opinion, whether it's pro or anti-China, because the public, in at least a lot of democracies, has a pretty good say or a pretty good influence on how deals are made. And finally, regime type. It's easier to make a deal if you have one autocrat rather than having to talk to an entire Congress, pass legislation, get a bunch of interest groups on board. And so those are other factors. But today we're going to be focusing on corruption and commodities offered. So there's a repetition of my question. And the first hypothesis involves corruption. How I came to the hypothesis was reading a bunch about corruption and the literature behind it, which one main finding is that an investor's decision to enter a market is a function of knowledge and experience. In the context of corruption, this means that if an investor itself is corrupt or accustomed to operating in a corrupt environment, it might not be deterred by operating in a new corrupt environment because it's familiar with what tactics to use in that corrupt environment. Also, though, the literature points out that when host countries, in this case being Latin America, have higher levels of corruption than the home country or the investor, in this case China, there are significantly lower levels of FDI inflows, leading me to make the hypothesis, if countries have lower levels of corruption, then they will likely see higher levels of Chinese investment. The second hypothesis involves commodities. Ho-Feng Hung from Johns Hopkins University notes that one driver of Chinese investment in the developing world is the need to secure commodities. And British economist Dunning notes that one of the 4 variables that influence where multinational enterprises invest is resources, leading me to the hypothesis, if countries have greater reserves or exports of commodities, then they will likely see higher levels of Chinese investment. Let's go through the corruption hypothesis methodology and test it out ourselves. With corruption, I use Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index. It's an index ranging from 0 to 100, 0 being absolutely corrupt, 100 being cleanest place you've ever seen in terms of institutional corruption. And so every country is assigned an annual score. The score comes from an amalgamation of different indicators coming from places like the World Bank, experts living within the country, and experts living outside the country, but studying whatever country's in question. And so I took the CPI, the Corruption Perception Index, for each Latin American country and China, and took the average from 2005 to 2020. That way we can hopefully compare the two and find how much do they differ in terms of corruption. And so every green dash on this slide you can see is that Latin American country's average corruption from 2005 to 2020. The red is constant because it's China every single time. So let's go back to the hypothesis. China wanting to invest in less corrupt countries. Those would be Bahamas, Chile, and Costa Rica. And you can see corruption levels because the green line is way higher than the red line. So relatively less corrupt than China's average. But when you look at the financial data, you see that none of those 3 countries really receive all that much Chinese investment. It's quite minimal, meaning Chinese investment does not necessarily go into less corrupt countries. So let's try the opposite. China and its investors go into corrupt countries, right? Let's try that out. So Ecuador, Guatemala, Guyana, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, all more corrupt than China on average. You look at the financial data, and it's a mixed bag. Ecuador and Venezuela have pretty high levels of Chinese investment. In fact, remember, they're in the top 5. But then you look at like Guyana, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Honduras, and they are near nothing in terms of investment. And so there's no definitive conclusion you can come through here. I also went through the year-by-year data, which I will not bore you with in this presentation, and there were no findings there as well. So I thought, let's look at if there's a pattern among the top 5 recipients of Chinese investments from 2005 to 2020, those being Argentina, Brazil, Ecuador, Peru, and Venezuela. Argentina, Brazil, and Peru are all roughly the same level of corruption as China. Meanwhile, Ecuador and Venezuela are more corrupt on average than China. There's even here not a set pattern. It's basically led me to the conclusion that it's not determinative that there's a clear relationship between Chinese investment level or number of projects and a Latin American country's level of corruption. So I want to try to find, okay, well, what could it be then? If it's not corruption, maybe it's commodities. So a repetition of my second hypothesis, if countries have greater reserves or exports of commodities, then they will likely see higher levels of Chinese investment. So I went through import and export data from Latin American countries of what they're exporting to China, and Chinese imports from Latin America, and found there's 3 commodities overall. Those being petroleum or oil, copper ore, and soybeans. China's likely interested in oil for 3 main reasons. First being, you see an increased standard of living in China. People are buying more cars, people are using more electricity because they're living nicer lives. How do you fuel all of that? Well, you fuel it with oil. Other energy resources too, but a lot with oil. And so even on the graph on the left side of the slide, you can see that the supply of energy in China by source is increasingly oil. Coal is still a massive amount. We'll get to that in the third point. But the second reason China may be wanting to increase its share of oil imports is because it is currently building its strategic petroleum reserves. The OECD, a lot of Western countries are part of that, recommend each country have a 90-day reserve of oil. China, as of 2019, is estimated to be around an 80-day reserve, and so they're still building it up. Who knows if they're going exactly to 90 days past before, it's unclear, but they're building up a strategic reserve regardless, and you need oil for that, because if you had some sort of energy shock, geopolitical tension, or just for some reason couldn't get energy because of a mishap, well, at least you have a reserve to keep your economy functioning. It doesn't grind to a standstill. The third reason oil is important is because a lot of Chinese citizens complain about the air quality and pollution. The reason China has so much pollution is largely due to coal-fired power plants. Coal is dirty as a fuel source. And so China, by switching more to oil and relying less on coal, can hopefully clean up its air quality. Of course, renewables are better than that, but oil does still help. So I went and looked to test their hypothesis, looked at the reserves of petroleum in each Latin American country. Venezuela overwhelmingly has the most, with over 300 billion barrels of petroleum, followed by Brazil and Mexico. So if the hypothesis is true, then we would expect the most investment going to these three countries. And in fact, Brazil receives overwhelmingly the most Chinese oil investment, with over $15.5 billion. In terms of percentages, take all the investments from China in Latin America from 2005 to 2020, 8% of it is going only to Brazilian oil. That is pretty substantial. And it's followed by Venezuela and Ecuador. One thing in common between all these three countries, besides having oil reserves, is that they are also in the top 3 recipients of Chinese investment. Now let's talk about copper. So copper is a fantastic conductor of electricity and cheaper than a lot of precious metals, which may also conduct electricity. So when China is trying to extend power grids and electricity access to more rural areas, or even just within urban areas, it needs copper to build those power grids. Additionally, China recently pledged to be carbon neutral by 2060, an ambitious goal. It requires a lot of new renewable energy sources. But solar panels, wind turbines, and electric cars, they do require significant portions of copper. In fact, the whole world, as it tries to go more toward renewable energy, is going to be seeking out copper. China itself does not have very big reserves of copper domestically, and so it looks abroad for copper, especially in Latin America, because Latin America possesses 40% of the world's copper reserves. China only has 3% of the world's copper reserves, not nearly enough to satisfy its needs now or in the future. And so if we see that Chile, Mexico, and Peru have 40% of the world's copper reserves and 30% of the 2019 production capacity, we would expect China to be investing in those countries for access to copper. And surely enough, Peru overwhelmingly receives the majority of Chinese copper investments, $14.3 billion worth within 15 years. And it's followed by Ecuador. Peru and Ecuador are both in the top 5 recipients of Chinese investment. Chile and Mexico are also there, but it's not notable enough to make much of an impact. Let's talk about the third commodity, soy. Soy is important because as Chinese people experience an increased standard of living, they eat more meat. How do you get more meat? Well, you get more animals to kill. How do you get more animals? You need to grow them using animal feed because they got to eat something. A lot of animal feed is made of soy. Soy is a tricky thing to grow domestically in China because it requires a lot of water, which China does not necessarily have. And second, its yield is not that great, meaning you need a lot of land for just a decent amount of soy. And so China looks abroad for its sources of soy, especially from the US, Argentina, and Brazil. But I want to see if this plays out in the investment strategy. I could not find exact data on how much soybean each country was producing, so I'm going to use arable land as a proxy because at least you can grow any crop on arable land. And so you could create new arable land and grow soy on it. So when you look at Latin America's arable land, Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico are the top 3 possessors of arable land. In fact, those 3 countries together have 85% of Latin America's arable land. So we'd expect, in terms of agricultural investments, that China would be investing here. And surely enough, Brazil and Argentina do receive the most Chinese investment for agricultural sector, followed by Venezuela and Chile. But one thing to note is Argentina and Brazil are in the top 5 recipients of Chinese investment in Latin America. So it's all checking out so far. You've probably noticed by now, where is Mexico? It keeps showing up in the top 3 of reserves. It has a lot of copper, it has a lot of petroleum, and it has a lot of arable land. Why isn't it receiving any Chinese investment? Well, I did a little case study on it, which I'll explain right after we hit the results of hypothesis number 2, which is that it's likely affirmative that China and state-owned enterprises tend to invest in Latin American countries with significant petroleum and copper ore reserves, as well as significant arable land, because you can grow soy or any other crops you might need to feed animals or your own population. So let's get to that case study on Mexico. I found there were 3 reasons why Mexico, despite having a lot of the commodities of need in China, why it didn't receive much investment. First being export competition. Mexico used to be the biggest exporter of manufactured goods to the North American market, meaning United States and Canada. However, after China began increasing its exports and being able to export more cheaply, Americans and Canadians began buying more from China, and Mexico essentially got placed out of the North American market by China, which likely led to bad relations and some grievances. So Mexico likely does not want to make as many deals with China. Why help your competitor if you're exporting very similar goods? The second reason is the lack of large financial backers. What do I mean by that? I mean, a lot of these investments, these mega investments and projects, you name it, they require not just backers from the Chinese side, but also the Latin American side. It's a lot of percentages, at least I saw in the data set, like 65% Chinese funded, 35% Latin American funded, whether depending on the country it's from. Mexico does not have these large financial backers like other Latin American states do, or that China does, and therefore it's harder to get deals made. And even if a deal is made, the third point is there is significant environmental and political roadblocks in Mexico. A deal could go through, but then some sort of legal challenge might occur, or it might face major public opposition and just get canceled because an environmental assessment wasn't carried out or it violated rights of an indigenous tribe. You name it, it has a higher chance of being canceled. So what does this all mean for policy? I find there's 2 main implications. The first being that the corruption narrative likely does not play out well in Latin America. So US officials should avoid equating Chinese investment in Latin America with corruption in Latin America. The second policy implication is that Chinese influence in Latin America is certainly stronger than before, especially pre-2005, as China invests steady amounts of foreign direct investment in Latin American countries. So the US may need to provide competitive alternatives to retain a foothold in Latin America. That concludes my thesis, but before I take any questions, I want to give a big thank you to my 3 advisors, Drs. Finger, Yeager, and Trincunas, as well as the teaching team, Drs. Yeager, Ewing, and Mir, and a shout out to my classmates, cohort, friends, family, roommates, everybody who supported me along the way this year. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Carter. That was quite interesting. So now we'll turn to questions and we'll begin with the advisors. Dr. Finger?
Thank you. Carter, terrific job in both the thesis so far and the presentation. That you looked at corruption in terms of was China attracted by corruption? Did it go where it could find or it could avoid corruption? But I wondered if you looked, since the critiques of Chinese behavior, there's a strand that says that dealing with China makes countries more corrupt, that the way the Chinese do business, payment of bribes and so forth. Did you look at or find any evidence one way or the other? Did the behavior on the corruption scale of any of the Latin American countries with large Chinese presence, investment change? And similarly, you mentioned in the introduction, UN voting. Did any Latin American voting patterns change because of interaction with China?
Both fantastic questions, and I'll address the second one first about UN voting behavior. And so the main UN voting behavior is prior to Chinese investments in Latin America, a lot of countries in Latin America recognize Taiwan as China. And so you have this whole debate between Taiwan and China being the like official China. And so recently, between like, I believe it was 2012 and 2018, a number of Latin American countries, mostly in Caribbean and Central America, being like Panama to Guatemala, changed recognition of China from Taiwan to mainland People's Republic of China. And so Taiwan essentially lost recognition from Latin American states, which could hurt its ability to interact in international organizations. And when I say its ability, I mean Taiwan's ability. The second question about corruption and China, whether it causes more corruption in Latin America. Overall, I find that it's not that Chinese investments increase corruption, it's that the Latin American state was already corrupt. And as a result, nothing changes, because if you have corrupt leaders getting more money, especially when in Latin America, a lot of the petroleum, a lot of the metal mines, they're run by the government. They just take the money and do what they want with it. So it's not that China's augmenting corruption, but it's also not doing anything to combat corruption.
Is it fair to say that among the conventional wisdom, the assertions about Chinese investment abroad, that the cases you looked at don't support those conventional judgments, that you don't see a pattern that would be consistent with such assertions? Is it strong enough to make the next statement that it undermines the generalizations about Chinese behavior?
I can say with certainty that it does not increase corruption. As to whether can I say that these Chinese investments, or my thesis undermines these claims, I cannot say that definitively, but it strongly suggests that that is not necessarily the case in Latin America. I don't want to speak to the rest of the world, but at least Latin America, that does not seem to be the case, especially when you look at a year by year, basically investment level and corruption levels. You have, sometimes corruption lessens and Chinese investment becomes greater. There's just every which pattern. I found no correlation when I looked year by year data.
One more question, and it's a suggestion as you.
Tom, because we're
okay. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Running out of time soon, and we still have two more advisors. Professor Yeager.
Thanks, Rod. So Kurt, great job with this thesis. You had a really challenging thesis, and you rounded up some really interesting data and made a lot with it. So I'm going to ask a very unfair question, which is I'm going to ask about your original thesis topic. So it takes two to tango with investment. You focus on motivations for the Chinese side to invest in a Latin American country. But now, knowing everything that you found, what do you think about the motivations of Latin American countries to accept Chinese investment versus their alternatives, whether it's the IMF or other alternatives to investment? Have you changed your thinking about that?
Certainly. In fact, I did not know hardly anything about Latin American economies before doing this thesis, and quickly learned that the IMF in Latin America don't have the nicest of relationships. And when I say that, I mean a lot of the Latin American states defaulted on their debt with Western-backed banks like the IMF. And so, like Argentina, for example, has defaulted, I don't know how many times, but more than on one hand's worth of fingers. And so it's a tricky relationship there. And so when not many, at least at this moment, not many other countries are offering these mega construction investments, what other choice does Latin America have? It wants to keep growing. It wants to offer a better standard of living for its citizens. And when I say they, I'm speaking generally about all Latin American countries. And so when Western investments often in Latin America, I guess, like social or more anti-corruption based projects. I mean, they're trying to strengthen like education systems or health systems, all good causes, but it's not as attractive as Chinese investments that say, we'll build you hydro dams to give energy to millions of people. We'll give you a new railroad, a high-speed one at that. We'll upgrade your ports. They're doing a much grander scale than Western alternatives. And so it's just attractive to Latin America when they have that option.
All right, we have just a few moments left, so let me turn to the last advisor, Dr. Trincunas.
Hi, Carter. Terrific presentation and a super interesting thesis, as you know, close to my heart since I work in Latin America. Let me touch on something we've discussed, but you didn't really present on, but I think is important, which is places that China avoids investing in. And we talked about Mexico in your presentation, but there's other countries which would seem pretty good candidates like Colombia. To what extent did a close relationship with the United States in your findings deter Chinese investment? So the fact that Colombia is a close partner of the United States in security terms in the region, does that affect Chinese thinking about investment?
Yeah, so I actually don't have any empirical data on this. I only briefly started looking at that about a month ago and found overall, if a country is closer aligned to the United States, especially with a security partnership, I know the US and Colombia have strong counter-narcotics cooperation. I don't know if this speaks to every Latin American state, I just know it speaks to Colombia, that it's another consideration if the Colombian government or major Colombian companies want to engage with China. They have to think, okay, is the United States going to get mad? But I think this is complex because it also depends on how would the US react. It's not simply the fact the United States is a security partner with this Latin American nation. It's would the US retaliate against a country like Colombia if they were to accept such an investment? And so that almost depends on US politics at the time.
Right, we're right at the end of time, and we still have a few questions in the Q&A. So we'll pass those questions on to Carter so that he can reflect on them, because the students are still working on their theses. So let's thank Carter for a job well done. And we'll reconvene in 5 minutes at which would be 3:15. Thank you. Okay. Welcome back for the second speaker of this series, who is Kate Yeager. Kate is currently studying history with a minor in Middle Eastern language, literature, and culture. She's pursued her interest in both cybersecurity and Middle Eastern politics through an internship at the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, and as the deputy head of the General H.R. McMaster's research team. She's received a Fulbright Award to pursue a master's in conflict research, management, and resolution at Hebrew University of Jerusalem next year. The title of her presentation is The Emergence of Cyber Conflicts in the Middle East. So Kate, it's all yours.
Thank you, Dr. Ewing. I'll go ahead and share my screen.
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. I hope everyone can see that all right. Great. Thanks so much. So today I'll be presenting the findings of my thesis, which will look at the emergence of cyber conflicts in the Middle East. So first, I want to begin in 2010. There was a malicious cyberworm known as Stuxnet that attacked a nuclear facility in Natanz, Iran, that essentially damaged quite significantly the uranium enriching facility that is located near Natanz. And this was kind of a pivotal moment in what many scholars viewed as the beginning of rising tensions in cyberspace within the Middle East. Normally, when we talk about cybersecurity, we speak about it in reference to the three major powers: Russia, China, and the United States. However, given the incredibly intense history of conventional warfare in the Middle East, I think it's crucial that cybersecurity become more integrated in the conversation on conflict within the region. And so as I was looking into the literature on this question, I kind of realized that while it's in its nascent phases, there's still more to be studied about the future of emerging technologies in the political sphere of the Middle East. So I was beginning to think about how the Middle East might be preparing for a continued increase in Middle Eastern cyber conflict and malicious cyber incidences within the region, given the fact that Stuxnet was 10 years ago. I was curious to see where we're going in terms of malicious cyber activity. So my thesis aims to answer the question, what motivates Middle Eastern states to develop cyber governance structures and the strategies that support them? To kind of give you a roadmap of how I'll present my thesis today, I'll first talk about the scope, my hypotheses, my methodology, and then I'll close with the policy implications of my findings. First, I'd like to discuss the countries that have been included in my data set. So I've looked at Egypt, Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Turkey, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain. I did not look at Oman or Yemen simply because there's not a whole lot of data available on those two nations, and they haven't been particularly involved in cybersecurity and have very few reported cases of significant cyber incidences. So I've kind of pursued two hypotheses as I've done my research. The first hypothesis is that Middle Eastern nations are motivated to develop cyber governance structures due to a heightened threat from within the region. This has a sub-hypothesis as well, which is essentially the assumption that the threat of significant cyber instances has been increasing year on year since the time of the turn of the century, but I'll really be looking at 2007 to 2020. So my second hypothesis is that international partnerships play a role in motivating cyber governance development in Middle Eastern states as well. But I want to begin by first discussing my first hypothesis. So in order to kind of understand what the threat is like in the Middle East and cyberspace and how Middle Eastern states might be responding to that threat, I distinguish between two types of threat. The first is the observed threat. In order to kind of measure what I believed was an observed threat or kind of more of an objective threat, I looked at the rate of significant cyber instances against Middle Eastern nations year on year since 2007. Perceived threat, I kind of looked at as how Middle Eastern states responded to the observed threat. Did they respond quickly? Did they respond with a strategy? Did they respond with a new structure? And how quickly did that happen? So first, I'd like to talk about my observed threat findings. So in order to kind of measure this observed threat, I went about developing a data set. I developed a data set of disruptive, significant cyber instances that threaten the national security of a state within the Middle East. I'll talk a bit more about what disruptive means in a second. But in order to kind of gather all of this data, I first turned to the data sets on significant cyber instances at the Council for Foreign Relations and also the Center for Strategic International Studies. I supplemented both these data sets with my own research on media output and government output from Middle Eastern states. So when I mean disruptive cyber instances, I'm kind of referring to this cyber threat classification system out of the University of Maryland from Dr. Harry and Dr. Gallagher. Essentially, they distinguish between two different types of significant cyber instances, exploitative and disruptive. So exploitative essentially aim to find a weakness and make the most of it in terms of achieving a given mission against an adversary. Disruptive is more of an attempt to damage, disrupt, or harm the ongoings of any sort of government structure. There's a list of attacks on the right-hand side, but I will not go through them. So within my data set, I tracked significant cyber instances, as I said, attributed or perpetuated against Middle Eastern states year on year from 2007 to 2020. I'd first like to acknowledge that there is a bit of a gap in the data in 2014 and 2015. This is not to say that there were no significant cyber instances in these years, but rather they were either unattributed, not made public, or just unavailable in the data sets that I had access to. But given that, we still can see that there's two big waves of significant increase in cyber incidences. The first one kind of comes in 2011 to 2013, and the second comes after a bit of a plateau in 2016, 2018, and 2019, and we see that peak come up in 2019 going into 2020, and I would predict that it would continue to go up in 2021, but time will tell on that one. So looking at the 2011 spike, that correlates to the beginning of the Syrian civil war as well as the Arab Spring. So my hypothesis about why these waves happen at these times is that significant cyber instances can be traced along both domestic turmoil within any given nation within the Middle East, but also international incidences. And that's really proven in the second wave. So in 2019, the Middle East faced an incredible amount of tensions. There was a lot going on between the US and Iran in the Gulf in that summer. And then also the United States announced a few different deals that really received some quite intense reactions across the region. So I'd like to talk about that a bit. So in the summer of 2019, there was a lot going on. The United States and Iran kind of went tit for tat on different escalatory events. The US accused Iran of attacking fuel tanks in the Gulf of Oman. Iran then shot down a really expensive drone. And then within a few days, the United States released its economic plan as a part of the deal of the century, which is essentially a peace deal that they hoped would broker some type of peace agreement between the Palestinians and the Israelis that essentially hinged on the economic development of the Palestinian state. That elicited quite a reaction out of the citizens of the Middle East. And there were widespread protests across the region. And there were also incredible protests at the diplomatic level. So a few days after the release of that program, there was a summit in Bahrain called Peace to Prosperity that many nations boycotted to stand in solidarity with Palestine. And those kind of tense conversations continued that summer. And we kind of saw that increase in cyber instances, as I explained earlier. So pulling on this data set even further, I was curious to see who was most often attacked. And what we can see here is that Israel faced the greatest number of attacks, followed by Iran and then Saudi Arabia, then it kind of trails off into the Gulf nations and Syria and Iraq as well. The fact that Israel faced the majority of attacks was something that was not necessarily surprising in my findings, considering the fact that Israel is commonly acknowledged to be an adversary to most Middle Eastern states, or Arab states, I should say. Iran similarly finds itself in that position. Israel and Iran are also really involved in cyberspace. They have very complex and very sophisticated structures and access to incredible tools. So as we'll see in a second, it's not only that they were targeted a lot, but they also facilitated a lot of attacks. So that kind of brings me to the attribution. What we can see here is that Iran is incredibly involved in facilitating these attacks against Middle Eastern nations. So Iran kind of leads with 35% of the attacks in my data set being attributed to Iran, followed by 25% being unattributed. For those of you who tuned into June's thesis last week, attribution is really difficult in cyberspace. And so it's not uncommon that cyber attacks kind of go unattributed. With Iran, there are some hypotheses about why Iran kind of has such a large number of attacks attributed to it. One of those hypotheses, or one of those arguments, I should say, is that Iran has an incredibly sophisticated cyber defense structure. They have multiple different hacking groups, and they're very involved in offensive activities, both within the region and abroad. They also like attribution. That's one argument that kind of exists in the scholarship, is that Iran believes that it benefits from the deterrence of being incredibly active in cyberspace. So we see Iran leads here. Then we have the unattributed cyber attacks, and then we kind of come into hacking groups. So when I was looking at this data set, I kind of divided it into a couple of different types of actors. I looked at nation states, I looked at political organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah, and then I looked at hacking groups. And these hacking groups are kind of comprised of professional hackers. And they are hired essentially to attack an individual, a nation, an organization, whatever the client kind of orders. And so I saw that hacking groups kind of were responsible for 10% of these attacks, followed by the UAE, Israel, and Syria. And then we move into the political organizations, which in my thesis are only Hezbollah and Hamas. And then the last few nations that are included in this data set are the United States, Russia, and North Korea. And those three nations are the three nations that were responsible for the least amount of attacks in my data set. So pulling up at an even higher level, what does this all mean? This essentially means that, as we can see here, the actors that were responsible for the majority of these attacks against Middle Eastern nations from 2007 to 2020 were nation states, not just nation states, but as we can see from this chart, nation states within the Middle East. So this kind of validates the hypothesis that Middle Eastern nations face the greatest threat from fellow Middle Eastern nations. So now I want to talk about the perceived threat a little bit. So we established the observed threat is rising, and the observed threat is coming from fellow Middle Eastern nations. The perceived threat was a way for me to understand how these nations were interpreting that observed threat. And again, there are limitations to the data that I had access to because it was publicly available. But in terms of the perceived threat, what I did was I mapped when each nation that I was looking at developed cybersecurity strategies and also cyber governance structures. So cyber governance structures vary a lot, country to country. And I kind of went about distinguishing between two types broadly. I looked at cyber defense kind of infrastructure or entities, and then I looked at cyber policy entities. For this presentation, I'll be focusing on cyber defense entities because they're more important. But I essentially looked to see if there were common threads in the strategies and common threads in when they were developed. This was a bit trickier with the data, purely because not every country has a strategy that's public and not every country makes its kind of cyber governance structures public as well. I'll first start with the strategies on the left-hand side. What we can see here is notably Israel and Iran do not have public-facing cybersecurity strategies. However, many countries do. Saudi Arabia kind of led the pack in 2011 with the earliest cybersecurity strategy, and then each nation kind of slowly followed on. One thing I thought was incredibly interesting about the strategies was that the UAE kind of trailed in 2019 as one of the last nations that I looked at to develop a cybersecurity strategy. I would suspect that this is just more when the UAE made the strategy public rather than when they devised it. Because if we look over here at the right-hand side with the cyber defense bodies, we see that the UAE was one of the first to develop the cyber defense structures that would allow it to kind of be more active in protecting itself in cyberspace. Now, some of the scholarship has suggested that because the UAE felt that it might be vulnerable after it was such a staunch American ally in early 2000s, it would need to kind of protect itself earlier in this emerging arena of competition. So it was one of the leaders in developing these structures, followed by Israel and Iran. Israel and Iran, again, is probably consistent with the findings that I talked about earlier, considering that they're two countries that are most involved in cyberspace, face the most attacks, and in Iran's case, kind of facilitate the most attacks as well. So I'd like to move on to hypothesis number 2, which is that international partnerships play a role in motivating cyber governance development in the Middle East. So in order to kind of differentiate between whether or not international partnerships are something that motivates Middle Eastern nations to develop these capabilities more in order to kind of pursue these relationships, or whether or not it's more of a situation that these partnerships are a byproduct of greater development in cybersecurity, I kind of differentiated between extra-regional partnerships and inter-regional partnerships. So what I mean by that is extra-regional partnerships are partnerships between a Middle Eastern state and an international organization or a country that is outside of the region. And what I kind of found as a consistent trend with extra-regional partnerships is that they are more often in a supportive capacity. So we have an example here of Jordan. Jordan was receiving aid from NATO to develop a CERT, which is a computer emergency response team, that was also coupled with greater support for cyber defense infrastructure, kind of alongside the conventional military support that NATO has been giving Jordan for a while. Lebanon also faced a similar situation where it was given counsel on developing a cybersecurity strategy by the European Union. So when we look more at interregional partnerships, they tend to be more collaborative, and they tend to be also in the private sector. So when I talk about collaborative, I mean that these partnerships often exist in pre-existing kind of councils or allegiances. So the GCC is a really great example. That's the Gulf Cooperation Council. They have these standing meetings on a variety of issues. They collaborate politically. There's been tensions in growing years, but they do have a meeting annually to discuss the emerging technologies and how that might be impacting the council itself. Countries like Qatar have called for war games in cyberspace, which is essentially an exercise to make sure that in the event that there was a problem, the countries could come together and they could work together to make sure that they were not being attacked too intensely. So like I said, there's also involvement in the private sector as well. There's a lot of outsourcing of cybersecurity technologies in the Middle East. Israel is known for really developed cybersecurity firms that the UAE has been known to buy technologies from, and Saudi Arabia as well. Similarly, the UAE is developing its own pretty robust technical sector, which brings me to kind of a new case that's really interesting. It's new and evolving, and I think it's something to keep an eye on. In 2020, there were the Abraham Accords, which were brokered by the United States, which are essentially an attempt for Arab nations to normalize their relations with Israel, that the United States, as I said, brokered. There was a collection of Arab states that decided to do this. The UAE was first. So the UAE and Israel signed the Abraham Accords, and then not long after, they announced a cyber allegiance of sorts, where they said that they would collaborate in cyberspace to defend themselves and continue to invest in technologies that might benefit both countries. As you see here, this is an interview from March 29th, which is not long ago, in English on an Israeli news channel, I-24. And we see the directors of cyber governance in the UAE and Israel live on television, kind of having a dialogue about how the two countries might come together to defend themselves against threats. Now, they also acknowledge the fact that after they announced this allegiance, minor cyber instances against both countries went up over 250%. So they acknowledge that while this partnership would help them defend themselves better, it also was a cause for increased malicious cyber activity dedicated against those two states. So implications of my findings. what I have essentially found is that the rate of significant cyber instances may continue to coincide with grassroots political movements and major geographical events. So as I said earlier, grassroots movements like the Arab Spring were kind of catalysts for increased cyber activity, and that also correlates to major geopolitical events like what was going on with the US and Iran, or even conversations around Israel and Palestine and peace processes there. Furthermore, international partnerships within the region in cyberspace or not in cyberspace may continue to contribute to both increasing levels of attacks, but also greater defense against these attacks. It's a bit too early to tell this for sure, but that is essentially what my findings would point to. And I think as we continue to watch new partnerships grow in the Middle East, it'll be something to watch for. Finally, I'd like to thank the teaching team, Dr. Yeager, Dr. Ewing, and Dr. Meir, for their support throughout this entire process, and my advisors, Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster and Dr. Blades, as well as my cohort, family, and friends. I'm excited to take questions.
Okay, thank you, Kate. Now we'll turn first to the advisors for questions. Professor Blades.
Hi, Kate. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. It's great to see how much progress you've made on this important project. I did have a couple of questions for you. The first is related to that gap in your empirical data. Can you say a little bit more about why there were no cyber incidents in 2014 and 2015? Could this be related to the fact that the situation stabilized in places like Egypt, for example, after the coup that took place? Or do you attribute this to things that were happening maybe internal to Iran or other countries? I was also interested in understanding more about your main claim about the political determinants of cybersecurity incidents. Who in the literature or in the policy world would argue that political developments are not going to be contributing to this outcome? I guess in order to understand more about the nature of your contribution, I really want you to kind of tell me what the counter hypotheses would be, or what would be the alternative hypothesis to this, because it does seem like a pretty intuitive argument that you might make. And so if you're able to sort of establish what are the main alternative claims that might exist in the literature or exist within the policy community, we could understand a little bit more about the nature of your contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Blades. Those were really interesting questions. I'll answer the first one. In terms of the gap in the data, that is a really great question. I think part of the reason that I found a gap might be because of that stability that you mentioned after kind of the 2011 to 2013 turmoil. Also, one thing that I suspected is I didn't look at information campaigns. I didn't look at rises in misinformation. I didn't look at hacktivism. I didn't look at things that kind of targeted individuals or political groups. I really looked at things that would threaten a nation state itself. And so I think there was probably a lot of activity, as I would suspect, around misinformation and different types of malicious cyber activity than what I looked at in those 2 years. I also do think that unfortunately in cyberspace, the data is just really tricky to come by. And so it might just be the case that the people decided to keep that public or keep that private in those years. In terms of your other question, honestly, I think that's something I have to think about a little bit. It's an incredibly interesting question. I think there are scholars who would argue that, yeah, counter to what I kind of argued, that, you know, these political incidences might increase cyber activity, that, you know, cyber attacks are non-escalatory. So how would that contribute to the political landscape? But I'll continue to think about that. That's a really good question.
Professor Blades, any other questions?
No, thank you very much, Kate, and congratulations.
All right, now to the next advisor, General McMaster.
Hey, Kate, I want to take a stab at Professor Blades' question to set up another question for you, right? So what I think is valuable about your research to me as I look at what you're doing is that it's important, first of all, to understand patterns. What are the patterns of certain activities, and how would you describe the pattern of cyber activity and establishment of cyber government structures in the Middle East? And when have you seen the pattern breaks? You've covered that a little bit, but I think what your research can do is help us understand better, not only what the pattern of activity is, but what a potential pattern break, when that might happen. What do you think a pattern break might look like going forward? What would the indicators and warnings of that pattern break be? And would there be any kind of false indicators that that we might think could indicate a pattern break, but maybe is just a continuation of the same sorts of competition that you've seen. And just a couple of the pattern breaks that I gleaned from your presentation is, it's a big spike in activity, but then also it's kind of the nature of that activity, the fact that how much of it was directed, for example, at particular countries. Or I think a major pattern break is the degree of cooperation, for example, between some of the Gulf states, and in particular UAE and Israel. So anyway, can you take a stab at that? What do you think is the pattern? How do you understand the patterns? And what would be the indicators and warnings be of a pattern break in cyber activity and the establishment of cyber government structures, and maybe even the types of multilateral cooperation you see on cyber threats?
Those are great questions. Thank you, sir. One of the things that I suspected kind of going into this that I thought would be a pattern break would be increased cooperation internationally in cyberspace. I kind of thought that if I looked into this really and found more relationships in cyberspace that kind of bolster defense capabilities, that there would be less significant cyber instances that got through. So I was kind of suspecting when I heard about this kind of Emirati and Israeli allegiance or partnership of sorts, that would kind of mitigate a lot of the attacks. And I don't think I was correct on that, but time will tell. I think it's early days. One of the things that surprised me that I'm still trying to make sense of in terms of a potential pattern break was another suspicion I had was essentially that cyber instances might increase more when there is greater international turmoil than domestic turmoil. And so when I was looking at that 2011 to 2013 wave of increase, I was kind of confused by that, because I was like, okay, the Arab Spring was definitely a region-wide movement. It was grassroots. But looking at the Syrian civil war, I kind of had to think about that for a second. So I was like, okay, that makes a bit more sense. There were lots of extra-regional actors involved in the Syrian civil war. There were lots of regional actors involved in the civil war. Maybe that as an international event was kind of what involved other nations in kind of creating greater chaos and doing what they wanted to in a period of great turmoil. And so I'm still trying to make sense of those breaks, but I think my original suspicions were not completely accurate, and but I don't have any definitive proof for you yet. But I think one thing I have learned, particularly about that international piece versus the domestic piece, is that domestic turmoil feeds into international turmoil and regional turmoil, and things can kind of spill over and get incredibly messy. And so my suspicion that if things were going wrong in one particular country, for instance, that wouldn't contribute to greater cyber activity within the region, I think that was inaccurate. And so I think one thing that we might watch for going forward in terms of, okay, when's another peak going to come is when do things start to get messy at like a grassroots level? When do people have kind of the need or the energy to organize, and when does that kind of political instability really take flight? That's I think one indicator we'll look at, but I'll get back to you on that, sir, for sure. Thank you for your questions.
Okay, great, thanks.
If I may, I'd like to follow up with a two finger on the issue of the patterns. I think people will be immediately attracted to this gap in your data set from 2014 to 2015. And when a data, from the look of it, that is, it just drops to zero, I think a fair assumption is, well, it wasn't zero, but we don't, for whatever reasons, it wasn't recorded or made available. Have you thought about how you might reconstruct what the values were based on the data on either side of those 2 years? That would be a clever, but also qualified way of kind of filling in what otherwise will always draw special attention to those years.
That is a great suggestion, and definitely something that I think I should look into more. One thing that I was considering to kind of make up for this, because I agree, I don't think there's nothing happening. I think there are many things happening, and that information just didn't get into the right places. One thing that I kind of have struggled with throughout this data collection process is, how do I incorporate campaigns? Because I'm measuring things temporally, and there have definitely been campaigns of pretty significant cyber instances that covered such a long period of time that I had to kind of pinpoint one major instance, and maybe I didn't count for that in the ways that I should have. And so I think one way I could do that is kind of reintegrate the campaigns separately and lay them over each other, and then use that, as you kind of suggested, to estimate or be able to better indicate what might have happened in 2014 and 2015.
Yeah, it would be speculative, but at least it would give you perhaps some sense of what might have been going on during those missing years. Right, let me throw this open to questions from your peers and the other faculty here. Just raise your hand. Carter.
Fantastic presentation, Kate. I realize this is kind of more of a predictive question, but you mentioned the Abraham Accords. So you have some Middle Eastern countries like normalizing relations. I'm wondering if more countries do some similar type of deal or join the Abraham Accords, how do you think this will change the cyberspace situation in the Middle East?
That's really great and incredibly interesting question. I was just thinking about that earlier in the case of a country like Morocco that signed the Abraham Accords, but has not kind of made such bold claims just yet about the ways in which it might collaborate with Israel in the defense sphere. I think that also, I mean, I didn't look at North Africa with the exception of Egypt in my data set, so that's probably something I can't speak to too much. But one of my suspicions about the uniqueness of the Emirati-Israeli relationship is that they're both incredibly cutting edge in their technologies. And so looking at other countries that have signed the Abraham Accords, like Morocco, for example, considering that those defense structures didn't exist before the Abraham Accords and they're not kind of on the same level, I do wonder how that's going to play out. And I wonder, as your question kind of prompted, as these accords potentially spread to other nations in the Middle East, which I suspect they will other nations follow suit and kind of engage? My suspicion is surely not, but I think we'll see country by country how that plays out. But I'm interested to see how that works. Thanks, Carter, for your question.
I'm just looking at the questions. Other questions now from your peers, other faculty members? Yeah, we have one, we're near the end, but let me read this question from Morgan Kaplan. Interesting research. You've done a lot of great work to shed light on how and why states respond to external cyber threats with increased cyber institutions and governance. Was there any evidence that states bolster their cyber capabilities to combat non-cyber threats?
Thank you, Dr. Ewing. That is an interesting question. That's not something I looked into, Morgan, but that is an interesting angle. I'll have to get back to you on that one. I wasn't kind of paying too much attention to how the conventional might have mapped onto the cyber at the same time. I was very much kind of focused on how the political was impacting the cyber and then how the cyber was impacting the political. But that's an incredibly interesting area for the research. So thank you for your suggestion.
All right, we've arrived at the end of the session. So let's thank both speakers for a fine job. Sorry you can't hear the applause. And my thanks to the participants in the audience and the outer audience. And we'll be here same time, same place a week from now. So I invite you for our last two honors thesis presentations at that time. Okay, thanks very much. Take care.